They said she was burying her grief. They were right, but not in the way they intended. The grief was a seed, and she was giving it to the only thing she trusted anymore, the earth. It began in the long, quiet heat of late July, a month after the doctor had shaken his head and walked away, leaving Amelia alone in the small cabin her husband had built. The stillness that followed was heavier than any sound. So she picked up a shovel. Her husband, Thomas, had been a man of straight lines and right angles. His fences were perfect, his barn a testament to the plumb bob. But Amelia was digging a hole. A vast, sloping pit in the south-facing side of the low hill behind her cabin. It was not a grave, not a root cellar, not anything her neighbors could name. By the second week, Mr. Henderson, whose land bordered hers to the east, rode over. He was a good man, the unofficial steward of their small valley's common sense. He stayed on his horse, a respectful distance from the growing mountain of excavated dirt. "Amelia," he began, his voice careful, gentle. "The ladies in town are concerned. Winter preparations need to be made. Firewood." Securing the livestock, she did not stop digging. The shovel sliced into the soil with a rhythmic sigh. She paused only to wipe sweat from her brow with the back of a dusty forearm, leaving a muddy streak across her face. "I'm making them," she said. Her voice was flat, unused. Henderson shifted in his saddle. Her dog, a scruffy brown mix named Buster who had been Thomas's shadow, lay in the shade of a lone cottonwood, watching the man with weary eyes. "Digging a hole is not preparation," Henderson said, his patience fraying into a schoolmaster's tone. "This is eccentric. People are talking. They say you've been touched by your loss." Amelia finally stopped. She planted the shovel in the earth and looked up at him. The sun was fierce, and it made her squint. Her gaze was clear, without a trace of the madness he seemed to be looking for. "They can talk," she said. "But the ground doesn't talk. It works." She bent back to her task. The conversation, for her, concluded. Mr. Henderson watched for another minute, a man trying to solve a puzzle with the wrong pieces. He saw a young widow, barely 25, engaged in a pointless, monumental act of labor under a punishing sun. He saw madness. He saw grief. He tipped his hat, a gesture of defeat, and rode away, the dust from his horse's hooves settling over the raw, wounded earth she had exposed. She did not watch him go. She was already 3 feet down and had another 7 to go. The work was a brutal comfort. Each shovelful of soil was a measure of time she did not have to spend inside the silent cabin, where every object held the shape of her husband's hands. Thomas had been a good man, but he had been wrong about many things. He had believed the prairie was a thing to be conquered, to be ruled with fences and plows. He saw the earth as a surface, a foundation upon which to build. Her grandmother, a woman from a colder, harder country across the sea, had taught her otherwise. The earth was not a floor, it was a blanket. "The deepest cold can't reach a seed that's sleeping far enough down," she used to say, her hand smelling of soil and chamomile. The earth holds its own slow warmth. It has a memory of the sun. As Amelia dug, she remembered those words. She remembered the stories of Wallapenis, the earth-sheltered greenhouses of a distant mountain people her grandmother had read about in a tattered book. A pit in the ground, a clear roof, and the angle of the winter sun. It was a simple, ancient geometry. Thomas would have laughed at it. "We have a root cellar, Amelia. That's how it's done." He trusted what he could see, what the other men in the valley did. He had no patience for old stories or strange ideas that came from books. His death had been a fever, a swift and merciless fire that had burned through him in 3 days, leaving behind only the chilling memory of his disbelief that such a thing could happen to him. The valley had mourned. The neighbors had brought casseroles and offered clumsy, heartfelt condolences. They had expected her to sell the ranch, to move back east to live with a sister she barely knew. They expected her to fold. Instead, she was digging. The blisters on her hands broke, hardened into calluses, and then formed new blisters beneath. Her back screamed in the mornings. But the pit grew. It was 12 feet wide and nearly 30 feet long, a great rectangular wound in the hillside. The north wall was the deepest, a sheer face of earth that would rise 10 feet from the floor. The south side was a gentle slope, angled to meet the sun. Buster would often bring her the ball they used to throw for Thomas, dropping it near the edge of the pit with a hopeful whine. She would stop, throw it once or twice, and then return to her work, the dog's disappointment a small, sharp ache she could not afford to indulge. By mid-August, the digging was done. The hole was a thing of shocking size, an aberration in the smooth roll of the prairie. Now came the building. She used the timber from a small, dilapidated shed at the far end of the property that Thomas had always meant to tear down. She dismantled it piece by piece, hauling the weathered planks to her construction site. She was not a carpenter, but she was methodical. She framed the east and west walls, and the low front wall, sinking the posts deep into the ground. The back wall was the earth itself. The work was slow, punctuated by trips to town in her small wagon for nails and supplies. In the general store, conversations would cease when she entered. Mrs. Gable, a woman whose piety was matched only by her capacity for gossip, would watch her with an expression of profound pity. Poor thing, she'd whisper to whoever was nearby, loud enough for Amelia to hear. Her mind is gone. Trying to build a house underground, a young farmer named Daniel, who had been a friend of Thomas's, approached her one afternoon as she was loading sacks of lime. "Amelia, what are you doing with all this?" he asked, his face earnest and worried. "They say you're buying glass." "A whole crate of it." "That's money you'll need for winter feed." "It is for winter," she replied, not meeting his eye. But nothing will grow. The ground will freeze 3 feet down. Any glass you put out there will be shattered by the first hard frost, or the weight of the snow. It's a waste." He was trying to be kind, trying to protect her from her own folly. He was speaking the language of this place, the conventional wisdom that kept everyone safe and fed. He was speaking his friend Thomas's language. "I appreciate your concern, Daniel," she said, finally looking at him. "But this is something I have to do." Her quiet finality left no room for argument. He helped her load the last sack, his movement stiff with disapproval. The purchase of the glass was the final confirmation for the valley. The freight agent had to special order it, and the cost was nearly all that was left of the money Thomas had set aside. When the crate arrived, it was the talk of the town for a week. Amelia was no longer just grieving, she was officially, indisputably, the valley's resident eccentric. A woman alone, squandering her inheritance on a glass-roofed hole in the ground. They watched her, and they waited for the coming winter to teach her the lesson they could not. The roof was the hardest part. She built a sturdy wooden frame, a single long slope angled precisely to face south, to catch the low arc of the winter sun. Each pane of glass was a terrifying weight in her hands, a fragile sheet of captured light that seemed impossibly delicate against the vast, harsh landscape. She set each one with painstaking care, sealing the edges with a mixture of pine pitch and beeswax that she rendered herself over a slow fire. The smell of hot pine filled the air for days. When the last pane was in place, she began the final, crucial step. Using a wheelbarrow, she started moving the great pile of excavated earth, banking it up against the east and west walls, and covering the entire northern half of the roof. She was insulating her structure with the very earth she had removed from it. From a distance, it no longer looked like a building. It looked like a natural mound, a strange scar on the hill, with a glittering sheet of glass embedded in its southern face. To her neighbors, it was the final act of madness. She was burying her own creation. Inside, however, was a different world. The air was cool and still, smelling of damp soil and raw wood. The light, filtered through the glass, was soft and golden. She built raised beds along the walls, filling them with a mixture of the best topsoil, sand from the creek bed, and compost she had been tending for a year. The inside of the north wall she whitewashed with lime, to reflect the precious sunlight back onto the plants. She laid a floor of flat stones, leaving a channel for water to run. And then, in late September, as the aspens in the high country were turning a brilliant, fiery yellow, she began to plant. Seed she had carefully saved from her summer garden: carrots, kale, hardy lettuces, spinach. And in the warmest, sunniest corner, a few tomato plants, a gamble she took on a memory of her grandmother's smile. It was a hidden world, a pocket of defiance against the coming cold. She had built not a tomb for her grief, but a womb for a future she was determined to see. As she worked, Buster would lie on a pile of empty sacks just inside the door, his tail thumping a slow, steady rhythm against the packed earth, a quiet beat of approval in the silent, sunlit space. The first hard frost arrived in the second week of October. It came silently in the night, a whisper of crystalline air that laid a glittering shroud over the valley. By morning, the last of the unharvested gardens in the town were blackened and limp. The season of growth was over. Mr. Henderson surveyed his own wilted pumpkin vines with a grim satisfaction. It was the predictable, immutable turn of the calendar. This was the way of things. He thought of Amelia's glass-roofed pit and shook his head. Whatever she had put in there would be dead now, too. A fool's hope, frozen solid. But inside the buried greenhouse, the frost had not penetrated. The temperature had dropped, but the massive thermal battery of the surrounding earth bled a gentle, residual warmth into the space. The air was chilled, but it was not frozen. The tiny green shoots of lettuce were untouched. The carrot tops remained a vibrant, feathery green. Amelia walked among her rows that morning, a steaming mug of coffee in her hand, and felt the first true stirring of something other than grief. It was a quiet, fierce joy. The sun, weak as it was, slanted through the glass, and the temperature inside slowly began to rise, a few precious degrees above the freezing air outside. Her gamble was holding. As the days grew shorter and the nights colder, the valley settled into its winter rhythm. Smoke curled from every chimney. The clang of the blacksmith's hammer echoed in the crisp air. People's lives contracted, pulling inward to the warmth of the hearth. They had their stores, barrels of salted pork, sacks of flour and cornmeal, cellars filled with potatoes, onions, and squash. They had what they needed to endure. The memory of Amelia's summer project faded, becoming just another local curiosity, a story to be told with a shake of the head. From the road, her homestead looked quieter than ever. The strange mound on the hill was just another snowdrift in the making. They assumed she was living on her own preserved goods, just like them. They imagined her alone in her cabin, regretting her wasted time and money. They pictured her eating dried beans and hardtack, a lonely figure in the encroaching winter, a lesson in the price of not listening to good sense. They pitied her. They did not know that every day, she descended a short flight of earthen steps into a secret summer. The winter arrived not as a guest, but as an invading army. The first blizzard hit in mid-November and did not relent for 4 days. It buried fences, obliterated roads, and piled snow in drifts that reached the eaves of the cabins. The valley was cut off. For a week, there was a lull, a period of blindingly bright, bitterly cold days. The valley dug itself out, paths were cleared, and a fragile sense of normalcy returned. Then the second storm came, even more ferocious than the first. And then a third. By Christmas, the old-timers were admitting they had never seen a winter like it. The cold was a physical presence, a thing that seeped through chinks in the walls and stole the heat from the warmest fire. The snow was a relentless, smothering blanket. The community's carefully calculated winter stores began to seem inadequate. The cattle, huddled in their barns, were consuming hay at an alarming rate. The firewood piles, which had looked like fortresses in October, were shrinking with terrifying speed. In the cellars, the relentless cold was penetrating the earth. Potatoes and apples, stored carefully, were freezing solid and turning to mush when they thawed. A quiet anxiety began to thread its way through the valley. Trips to the general store became more frequent, but the shelves were growing bare. No freight wagons could get through the high passes. The shared confidence of the community began to fray, replaced by a new, more personal arithmetic of survival. How many sacks of flour? How many cords of wood? How long could this possibly last? Amelia's world had also shrunk, but in a different way. Each morning, she would have to shovel the new snow off the glass roof of the greenhouse, a strenuous task that left her breathless in the thin, frigid air. But the effort was rewarded. Below the glass, under its thick blanket of insulating snow, her hidden garden was thriving. The kale was lush and dark green. The carrots, when she pulled one from the loose soil, were crisp and sweet. The tomatoes were ripening slowly, pale orange orbs that seemed to contain a defiant memory of the summer sun. She and Buster were eating well. Fresh salads in the dead of winter. Steamed greens with her salted pork. It was a private, almost unbelievable abundance. She knew the town was suffering, but she remained apart, her isolation now a shield rather than a wound. By February, the anxiety in the valley had curdled into fear. The winter showed no signs of breaking. The sun was a pale, useless disk in a sky the color of lead. The communal stores were gone. What people had in their own homes was all that was left. And then the sickness started. It began with the children, a profound lethargy, a weariness that sleep could not cure. Then came the small sores in their mouths, the unsettling bruising on their skin, the bleeding from their gums. The old doctor, a man named Harris who had seen more than his share of hardship, recognized it with a sinking heart. It was scurvy. The winter sickness, he called it, a disease born of a lack of life in the diet. A body starved of freshness began to fall apart from the inside. He had nothing to offer but useless advice. They need fresh vegetables, he told the worried parents. Fruits. Anything with vitality. It was a death sentence in a valley where the only thing not frozen was the salted meat in their barrels. Mr. Henderson's youngest daughter, a bright, cheerful 7-year-old named Sarah, was one of the first to fall seriously ill. She refused to eat the salty, monotonous food, and grew weaker by the day. Her gums bled whenever her mother tried to coax a piece of hard biscuit into her mouth. Henderson, a man defined by his pragmatism and common sense, was terrified. He felt his world, once so solid and predictable, dissolving into a nightmare. He looked at his pale, listless child and saw his own certainty, his own smug confidence, staring back at him as a kind of accusation. And then he remembered. He remembered the hole in the ground. The glass roof. The whispers of Amelia's folly. He remembered his own dismissive words, his patronizing advice. The thought of it burned with shame, but it was followed by a desperate, illogical sliver of hope. It was insane. Nothing could be alive out there. But his daughter was dying. And the memory of Amelia's quiet, unshakable confidence that summer suddenly seemed less like madness and more like a different kind of knowledge altogether. Pride was a luxury he could no longer afford. He pulled on his heaviest coat, wrapped a scarf over his face, and stepped out into the biting wind, his destination the one place in the valley he had once been so certain was a monument to foolishness. The journey to Amelia's homestead was a pilgrimage of shame. The snow was waist-deep in places, the wind sculpting it into monstrous, shifting shapes. Each step was a struggle, a physical manifestation of his own internal battle. The man who had ridden over on his horse in the summer, confident and righteous, was now wading through a frozen wasteland, a desperate beggar. He felt the full weight of his own arrogance. He and the rest of the valley had looked at Amelia's grief and judged it. They had seen her work as a symptom of a broken mind, not the action of a clear one. They had offered pity when they should have offered help, or at the very least, withheld their judgment. He finally saw her cabin, half buried in a drift, a thin ribbon of smoke rising from the chimney. And beside it, the mound. It was almost completely covered in snow, a smooth white hump on the landscape. But a section of it, a large rectangle, was clear, revealing the glass roof he had dismissed. It glittered faintly in the weak afternoon light. He reached her door, his chest heaving, his beard caked with ice. He knocked, the sound unnaturally loud in the profound silence. For a long moment, there was no answer. He was about to knock again when the door opened. Amelia stood there, her expression unreadable. She was not surprised to see him. Buster stood beside her, growling low in his chest until she placed a hand on his head. "Mr. Henderson," she said. It was not a question. "My daughter," he began, his voice cracking. "Sarah. She's sick. The doctor says. He says she needs fresh food." He could not bring himself to ask. The shame was too great. He fumbled inside his coat. "I can pay." "I'll pay whatever you ask." He held out a small leather pouch of coins. Amelia looked at the money, then back at his face, at the desperation in his eyes. She did not say, "I told you so." She did not remind him of his warnings or the town's mockery. She simply gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. "Wait here," she said, and closed the door. He stood on the porch, shivering, feeling the fool more acutely than ever. A few minutes later, she returned, wearing a heavy coat and carrying a lantern, though it was not yet dusk. "Come," she said. She led him not to her cellar, but to the mound. She lifted a heavy, insulated wooden door set into the earth, revealing a set of steep steps leading down into the darkness. She went first, the lantern light preceding her. Henderson hesitated for a second, then followed her down, out of the wind and the biting cold, into the earth. The air that met him was cool, but not frozen. It smelled of damp soil, of green, living things. It was the smell of spring. At the bottom of the steps, she held the lantern high. And he saw it. Rows of vibrant green letters. The dark, feathery tops of carrots. The deep, crinkled leaves of kale. And against the far wall, hanging like impossible jewels in the lantern light, were a half-dozen ripe, red tomatoes. It was a miracle. A secret, living world hidden beneath the dead one. He could only stare, speechless, the enormity of her foresight, of his own blindness, crashing down on him at once. Amelia moved through the rows with a quiet purpose, her lantern casting dancing shadows on the earthen walls. She took a small knife and cut a head of lettuce, its leaves crisp and full of life. She pulled 3 carrots from the soil, their bright orange a shock of color against the dark earth. She snipped a few large leaves of kale. Finally, she went to the tomato vines and chose 2 of the ripest, most perfect ones. She placed everything carefully into a small basket she had brought. Henderson watched her, his throat tight with an emotion he couldn't name. It was awe, but it was also a profound sense of realignment, as if the entire world he thought he knew had been turned on its head. This quiet, solitary woman, whom they had all dismissed, had understood the world more deeply than any of them. She had not fought the winter. She had burrowed under it. "Boil the carrot tops and the kale leaves into a broth for her," Amelia said, her voice soft in the enclosed space. "As strong as she can take it. The lettuce she can eat raw, if she has the strength. And the tomato. Crush it and give her the juice, a spoonful at a time." She was not just giving him food, she was giving him instructions, the wisdom that accompanied the miracle. She handed him the basket. Its weight was negligible, but it felt as heavy as gold in his hands. I don't know how to thank you," he stammered. She looked at him, her eyes clear in the lantern light. "Just make sure she eats it," she said. They walked back up the steps and into the brutal cold of the real world. The transition was jarring. The wind howled, and the setting sun cast long, blue shadows across the snow. It was a world of white and grey. But in his hands, he held green and orange and red. He held life. He turned to leave, but paused. "We were wrong, Amelia," he said, the words torn from him. "All of us. We were fools." She simply looked at him for a moment, then gave another small nod before turning and going back inside her cabin, Buster at her heels. Henderson began the long walk home, the basket held tight against his chest, a fragile cargo of hope against the crushing weight of the winter. He did not feel the cold. He felt only the urgent need to get this impossible bounty back to his daughter, and the dawning understanding that true resilience was not about standing tall against the storm, but knowing when to bow, when to go low, when to trust the deep, slow memory of the earth. The effect of the fresh food on Sarah Henderson was astonishing. Within a day, the bleeding in her gums had lessened. Within 3, a faint touch of color had returned to her cheeks. She drank the broth and the tomato juice, and then began to nibble at the lettuce leaves. It was as if her small body, starved for so long, was drinking in the very essence of life. The news spread through the valley not like wildfire, but like a slow, rising tide of disbelief, then wonder, then desperate hope. Mr. Henderson, a man whose word was trusted, told the story without embellishment. He described the descent into the earth, the smell of living plants, the sight of red tomatoes in February. He told them of Amelia's quiet dignity, her lack of recrimination. His testimony shattered the valley's collective certainty. The next day, it was Daniel, the young farmer, who made the trek to her door. He did not offer money. He stood on her porch, hat in hand, his face etched with worry for his own young wife, who was pregnant and ailing. "Amelia," he said, his voice thick with humility. "I was wrong. I came to ask for your help." Amelia gave him what she could spare. The day after, it was the husband of Mrs. Gable, a man who had always been a silent partner to his wife's gossip, his face grim and ashamed. One by one, they came. Not as a mob demanding their share, but as supplicants, their former arrogance replaced by a quiet, desperate need. Amelia never turned anyone away. But she was careful. She harvested sparingly, taking only what was needed for the sickest, explaining that the garden was small and had to last. She was not a savior performing miracles, she was a steward of a fragile ecosystem, a caretaker of a desperate hope. The buried greenhouse, her great folly, became the heart of the valley, pumping a thin but vital stream of life into the community. She taught Daniel the principles of its construction, sketching the angles in the frost on her cabin window. She explained the importance of the earth insulation, the orientation to the sun, the lime wash on the back wall. The knowledge, once her private inheritance, began to belong to the valley. Her grief, once buried, was now feeding them all. They had called it Amelia's folly. Now, they whispered its new name with reverence, the Winter Garden.